Tonight we descend into a chapter of American history that most would rather forget, a time when the crack epidemic swept through cities like wildfire, when mothers found themselves caught between addiction and responsibility, when survival meant navigating a maze of judgment, systemic failure, and impossible choices. This is not a story of heroes or villains, but of human beings trapped in circumstances that tested every limit of endurance. If you enjoy drifting through these forgotten corners of history, consider joining us for more tales that illuminate the shadows of the past. The 1980s arrived with promises of prosperity, with images of Wall Street success and suburban dreams flickering across television screens in homes across America. Yet beneath the glossy veneer of Reagan-era optimism, another reality was taking shape in neighborhoods that the evening news preferred to film from a distance. The introduction of crack cocaine into American cities created a crisis that would define a generation, and nowhere was this crisis more devastating than in the lives of mothers who found themselves ensnared by addiction while still carrying the impossible burden of parenthood. Imagine waking in a one-bedroom apartment where the walls are thin enough to hear your neighbor's television, where the carpet bears stains that tell stories you would rather not remember, where the morning light filters through curtains that have absorbed years of cigarette smoke and cooking grease. The alarm clock has not rung because sleep never truly came, only a series of fitful moments between consciousness and something resembling rest. Your body aches with a fatigue that goes deeper than muscles and bones, a weariness that has settled into your very soul after months or years of living on the edge of crisis. The apartment itself is a testament to survival rather than comfort. The furniture consists of whatever could be afforded or salvaged: a couch with cushions that sag in the middle, a kitchen table with uneven legs that wobbles whenever anyone leans upon it, a refrigerator that hums with an ominous sound suggesting its days are numbered. The linoleum floor in the kitchen has begun to peel at the corners, revealing layers of previous flooring beneath, each one a marker of the apartment's long history of temporary residents who came and went, leaving behind little except wear and tear. In the bathroom, the mirror is spotted with age and moisture. The grout between the tiles has darkened despite your efforts to scrub it clean, and the shower produces water that vacillates between scalding and frigid with no comfortable middle ground. The medicine cabinet contains a collection of half-used products, ancient bandages, expired aspirin, and the remnants of prescriptions from doctors you can no longer afford to visit. Everything in this space speaks of making do, of stretching resources beyond their intended limits, of the constant negotiation between necessity and deprivation. Your child sleeps in the other room, or perhaps on a makeshift bed in the living room, depending on the apartment's configuration. Their breathing is steady and peaceful, a sound that brings both comfort and anxiety as you contemplate another day of trying to provide while battling demons that whisper promises of escape. The toys scattered across the floor are a mixture of birthday gifts from relatives and dollar store finds, each one representing a small attempt to create normalcy in circumstances that are anything but normal. The crack of dawn brings not relief but a fresh wave of challenges to navigate. There is breakfast to conjure from whatever remains in the cupboards, usually some variation of cereal or instant oatmeal, perhaps toast if the bread has not yet developed those telltale spots of mold. The milk in the refrigerator must be sniffed carefully to determine whether it has crossed the line from questionable to unusable. Coffee is not a luxury but a necessity, brewed strong and black, because cream and sugar are expenditures that must sometimes be sacrificed for more pressing needs. The morning routine unfolds with a series of small negotiations and crises. Your child cannot find their other shoe, the one that has mysteriously vanished into the apartment's tendency to swallow small objects. The shirt they want to wear is still in the laundry pile, which has grown to proportions that would require an entire day to address properly. There is the search for lunch money, the scramble to sign permission slips that should have been returned days ago, the realization that tomorrow is picture day and there is nothing appropriate for your child to wear. Meanwhile, your own body is sending signals that cannot be ignored. The cravings that you have tried to suppress since opening your eyes have begun to intensify, creating a physical discomfort that mingles with the exhaustion and the stress. There is a pipe on the windowsill, or perhaps hidden in a drawer, or tucked behind books on a shelf, and its presence exerts a gravitational pull on your thoughts even as you try to focus on the tasks of motherhood. The internal battle between need and responsibility plays out in your mind like a war with no clear victor, only temporary truces that hold until the next wave of craving crashes over you. The walk to school or the bus stop is an exercise in maintaining appearances. You have learned to dress in layers that hide the weight you have lost, to apply makeup that conceals the shadows beneath your eyes, to smile in a way that suggests everything is under control. Other parents nod in greeting, some with warmth, others with barely concealed judgment in their expressions. You have become adept at reading these subtle signals, at knowing which mothers will engage in friendly conversation and which will pull their children a little closer when you approach. The school building looms ahead, a structure that represents both salvation and scrutiny. Teachers and administrators watch the children who arrive, noting which ones appear well-fed and rested, which ones seem to be wearing the same clothes as yesterday, which ones flinch when adults raise their voices. You have received calls from concerned teachers, visits from social workers who ask questions with practiced gentleness while taking notes that will be filed in folders with your name on them. Each interaction with the school system is a performance where you must demonstrate adequate parenting while hiding the aspects of your life that would trigger interventions you cannot afford. After dropping your child at school, the day stretches ahead with a mixture of obligations and empty hours. Perhaps there is work to attend if you have managed to maintain employment despite the chaos of your circumstances. The jobs available to mothers in your position are rarely stable or well-paying. You might clean houses for families who leave cash on the counter and avoid making eye contact, who worry about their valuables when you are alone in their homes. You might work retail shifts where you stand for hours, your feet aching, ringing up purchases for customers who complain about prices you could never afford yourself. Or perhaps work has become impossible to maintain, the unreliability of addiction having cost you too many missed shifts and unexplained absences. In this case, survival means piecing together income from whatever sources present themselves. There are the official channels, the welfare office with its endless forms and waiting rooms, the food stamp program that provides assistance while also marking you as someone who needs help, someone who has failed to achieve self-sufficiency in a society that values independence above all else. The welfare office is its own special circle of bureaucratic purgatory. The waiting room is filled with others in similar circumstances, mothers with crying babies, elderly people clutching folders of documents, men who stare at the floor with expressions of resignation. The chairs are hard plastic, bolted to the floor in rows that remind you of airport seating, designed for temporary occupation rather than comfort. The walls are painted in neutral tones that seem calculated to drain any remaining optimism from those who wait. When your number is finally called, you approach the desk with a mixture of hope and dread. The caseworker is tired, overworked, and has heard every story and excuse imaginable. They ask questions about your income, your living situation, your child's needs, and you answer carefully, omitting certain details, emphasizing others, walking the tightrope between qualifying for assistance and revealing too much about the precariousness of your situation. Forms are filled out in triplicate, signatures are required, and you are told to expect a decision in 4 to 6 weeks, during which time you must simply continue surviving somehow. Food stamps arrive on a plastic card that looks innocuously like any other payment card, but you are acutely aware that the checkout clerk can see what you are using, that the people in line behind you are watching and perhaps judging. You have learned which stores are more discreet, which neighborhoods are less likely to contain people you know, which times of day the grocery store is emptiest so you can shop without an audience. The calculations required to stretch food assistance through an entire month are complex, requiring strategic thinking about which items provide the most calories per dollar, which sales are worth taking advantage of, which luxuries must be sacrificed entirely. The pantry in your apartment tells the story of these calculations. There are the staples purchased in bulk when possible, rice and pasta and beans, foods that can be stretched across multiple meals. There are the jarred sauces and canned vegetables, compromise ingredients that allow you to create something resembling a home-cooked meal without the time or resources for fresh ingredients. There are the boxes of macaroni and cheese, that iconic staple of struggling families, which your child will eat without complaint even as you grow weary of its artificial orange hue. Lunch for your child becomes a source of particular stress. Other children arrive at school with packed lunches containing fresh fruit, sandwiches made with specialty bread, juice boxes in flavors you have never seen at the corner store. Your child receives free lunch through the school program, a benefit you are grateful for, but which also marks them as different, as one of the students whose families cannot afford to pay. On days when the school menu features something particularly unappetizing, you try to pack an alternative, even if it is just a peanut butter sandwich on generic white bread and an apple that has seen better days. The economics of poverty are counterintuitive in ways that those who have never experienced it struggle to understand. It is expensive to be poor. You cannot afford to buy in bulk, which means paying more per unit for smaller quantities. You cannot afford quality items that will last, which means repeatedly replacing cheap shoes and clothing that wear out quickly. You cannot afford preventative health care, which means minor issues escalate into emergencies that cost exponentially more to address. You cannot afford childcare, which limits your ability to work, which perpetuates the cycle of insufficient income. Into this already impossible situation, addiction introduces an additional drain on resources that makes mathematical sense of the family budget essentially impossible. The money that should go to rent or utilities or food is diverted, sometimes a little, sometimes a lot, toward purchasing crack cocaine from dealers who operate in the shadows of the neighborhood. These transactions happen quickly, in alleys or parking lots or stairwells, money and product exchanged in moments that carry the constant risk of police intervention or violence from competitors in the drug trade. The crack itself comes in small rocks, innocuous-looking crystals that could be mistaken for soap or candy if one did not know better. When heated in a pipe, it produces a vapor that, when inhaled, creates an intense but brief high that users describe as euphoric, all-consuming, and desperately sought after once the brain has learned to crave it. The high lasts minutes at most, followed by a crash that leaves the user craving more, creating a cycle of use that can rapidly escalate from occasional to constant. For a mother trapped in this cycle, the daily routine becomes a careful choreography of hiding and managing the addiction while attempting to maintain the responsibilities of parenthood. The pipe must be kept out of sight of children, used during moments of privacy that are rare in small apartments with thin walls. The smell of burnt cocaine must be covered with air freshener or blamed on a neighbor. The physical effects of use, the dilated pupils and increased energy followed by exhaustion and irritability, must be explained away as stress or illness or simply the demands of life. Children in these households often learn to read their mother's moods with an accuracy born of necessity. They learn when to be quiet and when it is safe to ask for things, when to make themselves scarce and when their presence is needed. They learn to accept explanations that do not quite make sense, to ignore evidence of things they are too young to fully understand, to adapt to instability as the only constant in their lives. The resilience of these children is remarkable and tragic in equal measure, a testament to the human capacity to survive in conditions that should not exist. The emotional toll of addiction, layered atop the demands of single motherhood, creates a psychological pressure that is difficult to convey to those who have not experienced it. There is the guilt, constant and gnawing, about every choice and every failure, every time you chose the drug over something your child needed, every promise you broke, every moment of their childhood that you experienced through the fog of intoxication. There is the shame of being unable to stop, despite wanting to, despite understanding that you are hurting yourself and your child, despite trying repeatedly to quit, only to relapse again and again. There is also the isolation, because addiction carries a stigma that severs social connections. Friends and family members who might have offered support grow tired of the cycle of promises and relapses, of lending money that never gets repaid, of watching someone they care about destroy themselves by degrees. The community of other users provides a form of companionship, but it is a connection built on shared dysfunction rather than genuine intimacy, relationships that often facilitate continued use rather than supporting recovery. The 1980s were a period when American society's response to drug addiction was punitive rather than therapeutic, emphasizing criminalization and moral failing rather than recognizing addiction as a medical condition requiring treatment. The war on drugs, declared with great fanfare and substantial funding, focused on enforcement and incarceration, filling prisons with nonviolent drug offenders while doing little to address the underlying causes of addiction or to provide resources for recovery. For mothers caught in this system, the threat of criminal charges added another layer of terror to an already desperate situation. A knock on the door could mean any number of things, but none of them good. It might be a social worker following up on a report from a teacher or neighbor, armed with questions and a clipboard, observing the apartment for signs of neglect or abuse, evaluating whether the child is safe or should be removed. It might be the landlord demanding rent that is already weeks overdue, threatening eviction that would leave you and your child homeless. It might be police responding to a complaint or executing a warrant, ready to search the premises and arrest anyone found in possession of illegal substances. The foster care system loomed as perhaps the most terrifying threat, the possibility that haunted every interaction with authority figures. Children could be removed from homes deemed unfit, placed with foster families or in group homes, sometimes temporarily but often for months or years, sometimes permanently if parental rights were terminated. The standards for what constituted an unfit home were nebulous and subject to the judgment of caseworkers who were themselves overworked and dealing with impossible caseloads. A dirty apartment, a positive drug test, a missed appointment could all contribute to a decision to remove a child, tearing apart families in the name of protection. For mothers, the prospect of losing their children represented a failure so profound that it eclipsed all other concerns. However chaotic the situation, however much addiction had disrupted their lives, their children remained the center around which everything else revolved. The bond between mother and child persisted even in the worst circumstances, a love that remained intact even when behavior suggested otherwise. The moments of clarity, when the fog of addiction lifted temporarily, were often filled with an agony of awareness about how far the situation had deteriorated, how much damage was being done, how desperately change was needed, and how impossibly difficult change seemed. Attempts at recovery were frequent but rarely successful without significant support, which was in short supply during the 1980s. Treatment programs existed, but they often had long waiting lists, required insurance or payment that was beyond reach, and were not designed to accommodate mothers with children. Detoxification from crack cocaine involves no physical danger comparable to alcohol or heroin withdrawal, but the psychological cravings are intense and persistent, making relapse extremely common in the weeks and months after cessation. Without ongoing support, without addressing the trauma and circumstances that contributed to addiction, without providing practical assistance with housing and employment, recovery remained elusive. The neighborhood itself played a role in perpetuating addiction, as crack cocaine was readily available on seemingly every corner, sold by dealers who ranged from desperate users trying to support their own habits to organized operations that treated drug sales as a business. The dealers knew their customers by name, extended credit when money was short, and always had product available. The relationship between dealer and user was transactional, but also parasitic, a dependency that ensured continued sales regardless of the harm being inflicted. Violence was an ever-present threat in neighborhoods where the crack trade flourished. Disputes over territory, over debts, over perceived disrespect could escalate rapidly into shootings or beatings. Mothers, walking their children to school, had to navigate streets where violence might erupt without warning, where the sound of gunshots was common enough to barely merit comment. Children grew up understanding that certain blocks were dangerous, that certain people should be avoided, that the police were as likely to cause problems as to solve them. The police presence in these neighborhoods was heavy but rarely helpful. Officers patrolled with an attitude of suspicion, viewing residents as potential criminals rather than citizens deserving protection. Stop and frisk policies meant that anyone could be detained and searched without particular cause, a practice that disproportionately targeted Black and Hispanic residents. For mothers with addiction issues, any encounter with police carried the risk of arrest, of having children taken into protective custody, of acquiring a criminal record that would make future employment even more difficult to obtain. Inside the apartment, the daily struggle to maintain some semblance of normal family life continued despite the chaos. Meals were prepared, such as they were, from the limited ingredients available. Breakfast might be a bowl of generic cereal with milk that was on the verge of spoiling, or toast with margarine, or instant oatmeal mixed with water because the milk had run out. The child ate hungrily, oblivious to the nutritional deficiencies of the meal, focused instead on the cartoon playing on the television set that dominated one corner of the living room. Laundry was an expedition that required gathering enough quarters to operate the machines in the building's basement or at a laundromat several blocks away. The bags of dirty clothes were heavy, the walk was long, and the laundromat itself was a depressing space with fluorescent lighting and a clientele of others who, like you, were managing the basic tasks of life on the margins of society. The machines ate quarters at an alarming rate, and there was always the risk that someone would steal your clothes if you stepped away, forcing you to remain for the hours required to wash, dry, and fold. Bathing the child happened in a tub that was never quite clean, using shampoo that claimed to be gentle but still stung when it got in eyes. There was splashing and laughter, brief moments when the stress lifted and you were simply a mother playing with a child, making bubble beards and discussing important topics like whether fish get cold in winter. These moments were precious precisely because they were temporary, islands of normalcy in a sea of dysfunction, reminders of what life might be like if circumstances were different. Bedtime brought its own challenges. The child resisted sleep, wanting more stories, more water, more reassurances that you would be there in the morning. You read from whatever books were available, usually worn paperbacks from thrift stores or the public library, doing silly voices for the characters and answering the endless questions that children ask about why things are the way they are. Eventually, exhaustion won, and the child's breathing deepened into sleep, leaving you alone with your thoughts and your cravings in the quiet apartment. The nights were perhaps the most difficult time, when the child was asleep and the temptation to use was strongest. The pipe called to you with a voice that grew louder as the hours passed, promising relief from stress, from guilt, from the constant pressure of trying to survive. Sometimes you resisted, sitting by the window and smoking cigarettes, watching the city lights and trying to imagine a different life. Sometimes you did not resist, telling yourself it would be just once, just enough to take the edge off, knowing even as you prepared the pipe that once would not be enough, that the cycle would continue. The high, when it came, was as powerful and fleeting as ever. For a few minutes, everything seemed possible, problems seemed solvable, the weight lifted from your shoulders, and you felt capable and strong and free. Then the drug wore off, and reality returned, made worse by the crash, by the self-loathing that accompanied another failure to resist, by the knowledge that money needed for other purposes had been converted into a few minutes of escape that solved nothing and complicated everything. Morning arrived too soon, the alarm or the child's voice pulling you back from whatever sleep you had managed to achieve. The cycle began again, another day of juggling impossible demands, of hiding and lying and scraping together resources, of loving your child fiercely while also failing them in ways both small and large. The calendar on the refrigerator was marked with appointments that needed to be kept, school events to attend, bills that were due, a visual representation of the many ways in which your life was barely held together. The media's portrayal of crack-addicted mothers during the 1980s was uniformly negative, focusing on sensational stories of babies born exposed to drugs, of children neglected or abused, of moral decay and social pathology. Morning arrived too soon, the alarm or the child's voice pulling you back from whatever sleep you had managed to achieve. The cycle began again, another day of juggling impossible demands, of hiding and lying and scraping together resources, of loving your child fiercely while also failing them in ways both small and large. The calendar on the refrigerator was marked with appointments that needed to be kept, school events to attend, bills that were due, a visual representation of the many ways in which your life was barely held together. The media's portrayal of crack-addicted mothers during the 1980s was uniformly negative, focusing on sensational stories of babies born exposed to drugs, of children neglected or abused, of moral decay and social pathology. The term crack baby entered the popular lexicon, referring to infants supposedly damaged irreparably by prenatal drug exposure, predictions of a generation of damaged children that would burden society for decades. These predictions later proved to be exaggerated, based on flawed research and moral panic rather than scientific evidence. But they shaped public perception and policy in ways that stigmatized mothers and justified punitive responses. The reality, as is often the case, was more complex than the media narrative suggested. Yes, crack cocaine use during pregnancy posed risks to fetal development, as did many other factors, including malnutrition, lack of prenatal care, and stress. But the outcomes were not uniformly catastrophic, and many children born to mothers who used drugs during pregnancy developed normally when provided with adequate care and support. The focus on prenatal drug exposure, while ignoring the broader context of poverty and lack of health care, revealed more about society's prejudices than about the actual impacts of drug use. Pregnant women with addictions faced an impossible dilemma. Seeking prenatal care meant risking detection of drug use, which could lead to criminal charges or loss of custody of the child immediately upon birth. Many states prosecuted pregnant women for drug use under child abuse or drug distribution statutes, creating a situation where women were punished for their addiction rather than offered treatment. The result was that many women avoided prenatal care entirely, increasing the actual risks to both mother and child in order to escape the legal consequences of seeking help. The child welfare system's response to maternal addiction was removal rather than rehabilitation. Children were taken from mothers who tested positive for drugs, placed in foster care where outcomes were highly variable and often not better than remaining with biological parents who, despite their struggles, loved their children and wanted what was best for them. The trauma of separation itself inflicted harm on children, disrupting attachment and creating its own psychological damage. Yet the system continued to prioritize removal, operating under the assumption that any drug use rendered a mother unfit regardless of other factors. For mothers who lost custody of their children, the path to reunification was deliberately made difficult, requiring completion of treatment programs, maintenance of sobriety, demonstration of stable housing and employment, all while navigating a bureaucratic system that was adversarial rather than supportive. The emotional devastation of losing a child often triggered deeper addiction, creating a vicious cycle where the very intervention meant to protect children made recovery less likely. Some mothers never regained custody, their parental rights eventually terminated, their children adopted by strangers, the bond severed permanently by policies that emphasized punishment over compassion. The economic aspects of the crack trade deserve examination, as the epidemic was not simply a story of individual moral failure, but also a systemic issue with roots in economics and policy. Crack cocaine was cheap compared to powder cocaine, making it accessible to poor communities in a way that powder was not. The drug's high profitability, combined with limited legal economic opportunities in deindustrialized urban areas, meant that selling crack became a rational choice for many residents seeking income. The violence associated with the trade was a predictable consequence of operating outside legal structures, where disputes could not be resolved through courts and contracts were enforced through intimidation. The racial dimensions of the crack epidemic and society's response to it cannot be ignored. While drug use and addiction cut across all demographic lines, crack use was concentrated in Black and Hispanic urban communities, and the response was racialized from the outset. Sentencing laws made possession of crack cocaine, associated with Black users, punishable far more severely than possession of powder cocaine, associated with white users, despite the substances being chemically nearly identical. The result was mass incarceration of Black men and women, destroying families and communities, while wealthy white drug users faced treatment rather than prison. For the mothers caught in this maelstrom, race complicated every interaction with institutions. Black mothers were more likely to be reported to Child Protective Services, more likely to have their drug use detected through mandatory testing, more likely to lose custody of their children, and less likely to be offered opportunities for reunification. The stereotype of the Black welfare queen persisted in public discourse, despite bearing little resemblance to reality, shaping policies that were explicitly designed to punish rather than help. White mothers with addictions often received more sympathy and more access to treatment, though they too faced substantial barriers. The daily reality of managing addiction while parenting meant constant calculations about risk and reward, about when it was safe to use and when it was not, about how much money could be diverted to drugs without causing immediate crisis. Some mothers used only when children were at school or asleep, maintaining a separation between their two lives. Others found the cravings impossible to schedule around, using at all hours, allowing the addiction to overtake the routines of family life. The degree of dysfunction varied, but in all cases, the stress of trying to maintain the deception was enormous. Children's birthdays were occasions of particular pain, highlighting the gap between what you wanted to provide and what was actually possible. There might be a cake from the grocery store, candles, maybe a small gift purchased with money that should have gone to other necessities. You sang happy birthday with enthusiasm that masked your awareness that this was not the celebration your child deserved, that other children had parties with themes and decorations and many guests, that your limitations were showing in ways your child would eventually understand and remember. The child's happiness in the moment provided some comfort, but it was tinged with sadness about all that you could not give. Holidays followed similar patterns, Christmas especially, when the pressure to provide gifts and create magic was intense. The toys you managed to obtain were often secondhand, missing pieces, or cheaper versions of what children saw in advertisements. You wrapped them carefully, presented them with love, and hoped that would be enough. Your own childhood memories of holidays might have been difficult, creating a determination that your child's experience would be better, even as circumstances conspired to limit what was possible. The volunteer programs that provided toys to needy families were a resource, but also a reminder of your position in society's hierarchy. School presented ongoing challenges beyond the daily drop-off routine. There were parent-teacher conferences where you sat in child-sized chairs and listened to assessments of your child's progress, trying to focus while wondering if the teacher could tell that you were high, or coming down, or desperately wishing you were high. There were requests for money for field trips or school supplies, requests you could not always fulfill, resulting in your child being left behind while classmates went to museums or brought in elaborate projects. There were questions about why you missed the last conference, why the homework was not completed, why your child seemed tired or distracted or hungry. The other parents at school functions were a constant source of comparison and anxiety. They seemed so put together, so capable, so utterly foreign in their discussion of concerns that seemed trivial from your perspective. They worried about which soccer league to join or whether their child should skip a grade, while you worried about whether you could keep the lights on and avoid eviction. The class divide was palpable, and you felt yourself being judged, categorized as one of those mothers whose presence at school events was irregular and whose children were marked as disadvantaged. Friendships were difficult to maintain when addiction dominated your life. People who had been close drifted away, tired of the chaos, tired of covering for you or lending money that was never repaid, tired of watching you make promises you could not keep. The isolation deepened, leaving you without the social support that might have made recovery more possible. The only people who remained were often other users, relationships built around shared addiction rather than genuine connection. Friends who might help you get high, but who could not be counted on for real support. Healthcare was largely inaccessible, relegated to emergency rooms when situations became critical, resulting in treatment that addressed acute problems but did nothing for underlying conditions. You postponed dealing with dental issues until teeth ached unbearably, ignored symptoms that should have been evaluated, skipped medications that had been prescribed because the copays were unaffordable. Your child's healthcare was prioritized to the extent possible, using Medicaid when you could navigate the enrollment process, but even pediatric appointments were sometimes missed when the chaos of addiction made it impossible to keep track of schedules. The physical toll of addiction manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. Weight loss was common, as crack suppressed appetite and limited resources were directed to drugs rather than food. Your clothes hung loosely on a frame that had once been fuller, your face gaunt, your skin showing the effects of poor nutrition and insufficient sleep. Your teeth suffered from the combination of drug use, inadequate dental care, and the tendency to neglect oral hygiene during periods of heavy use. You looked older than your years, the stress and substance use accelerating aging in ways that would become more apparent as time passed. The emotional numbness that often accompanies addiction served as both protection and loss.
It was easier to function when you were not fully feeling the weight of your circumstances, when the shame and guilt and fear were held at a distance by the fog of intoxication.
But this numbness also meant missing the full experience of motherhood, being present physically but absent emotionally, going through the motions without fully engaging. Years later, if recovery came, you would look back on this period with grief for all the moments you missed, all the times when your child needed you to be fully present and you were not. Yet love persisted, complicated and fierce, and never fully extinguished by addiction. You loved your child with an intensity that made the guilt more painful, that fueled the repeated attempts to quit, that motivated you to keep going even when surrender seemed easier. The moments of connection, when you were sober enough to be truly present, were treasured, stored in memory as evidence that you were still a mother beneath the addiction, still capable of providing what your child needed even if those moments were too rare. The question of how to explain your situation to your child was ongoing and agonizing. They were too young to understand addiction, but old enough to sense that something was wrong, that other families functioned differently, that their home life was marked by instability and unpredictability. You tried to shield them from the worst of it, to maintain routines and normalcy where possible, to be the mother you wanted to be even when the addiction made that impossible. The lies you told were meant to protect, to preserve their childhood innocence, but they also created confusion and taught lessons about deception that you did not intend. The support systems that might have made a difference were largely absent during the 1980s. Treatment programs were few and often excluded mothers with children, requiring weeks or months of residential treatment that was impossible when you had no one to care for your child. Outpatient options were limited and rarely addressed the underlying trauma and circumstances that contributed to addiction. 12-step programs like Narcotics Anonymous offered free support but required a degree of stability and commitment that was difficult to maintain while managing the chaos of active addiction. The few support groups that did exist for mothers provided a rare space of understanding and lack of judgment. Sitting in a circle of folding chairs in a community center basement, sharing stories with women whose experiences mirrored your own, created a sense of connection that had been absent from your life. Here you could admit to feelings and behaviors that would be condemned elsewhere, could receive empathy rather than censure, could hear stories of recovery that suggested change might be possible. These groups were lifelines, offering hope in small doses, reminding you that you were not alone even in your worst moments. The caseworkers and social workers assigned to your case were variable in their approach, some genuinely wanting to help, others burned out and judgmental, all operating within systems that were underfunded and overstretched. The good ones recognized that addiction was a disease rather than a moral failing, tried to connect you with resources, advocated for you within bureaucracies that were indifferent at best. The others saw you as a problem to be managed, a file to be closed, a case that was taking up time that could be spent on more deserving clients. Learning to navigate these relationships, to present yourself in ways that would elicit help rather than punishment, was a skill developed through necessity. The neighborhood where you lived had its own informal support networks, neighbors who watched out for each other's children, who shared food when someone was particularly short, who warned about police activity or dangerous situations. These networks were vital, providing assistance that government programs did not, rooted in shared experience and mutual understanding. At the same time, the neighborhood could be judgmental, rumors spreading about who was using, who had lost custody of children, who had been arrested. Maintaining reputation was impossible, and eventually you stopped trying, accepting that you were the subject of gossip and speculation. The summer was particularly difficult when children were out of school and needed supervision and entertainment for long, empty days. The parks were free but often dangerous, playgrounds where drug deals happened inside of children, where violence could erupt without warning. Keeping your child safe and occupied without resources was a daily challenge, solved partially with television, partially with coloring books and used toys, partially with trips to the library for free air conditioning and books. You felt guilty about the amount of screen time, about the lack of educational activities or summer camps, about another summer that would be remembered more for boredom than joy. As the months and years passed in this manner, the question of whether change was possible grew more pressing. Addiction had become the defining feature of your life, organizing every day around the need to obtain and use crack cocaine, subordinating all other concerns to the demands of the drug. The future seemed foreclosed, impossible to imagine beyond the immediate crisis of today and perhaps tomorrow. Dreams you might have once had, aspirations for yourself or your child, seemed like artifacts from another person's life, irrelevant to your current circumstances. Yet the human capacity for hope is remarkable in its persistence. Even in the depths of addiction, even after countless failures to quit, some part of you continued to believe that change was possible, that tomorrow might be the day when everything finally clicked into place, when you would find the strength to stop using and begin rebuilding your life. This hope was irrational given the evidence, but it was also what kept you alive, what prevented complete surrender to despair. You made promises to yourself, to your child, to whatever higher power you might have believed in, knowing you would probably break them, but making them anyway, because the alternative was giving up entirely. The crack epidemic of the 1980s would eventually recede, not because society developed effective responses, but because the drug's popularity waned. Because a generation of users burned out or died or found recovery. Because new drugs emerged to take its place in the market. The policy responses, the mass incarceration, the destruction of families, these would leave scars that persisted for decades, shaping communities and lives long after the peak of the crisis had passed. For the mothers who lived through this period, who survived or did not survive, who maintained their families or lost them, the experience would define their lives in ways that outsiders could never fully understand. Looking back from the vantage point of the present, we can see more clearly the failures of policy and compassion during that era. We can recognize that criminalization was the wrong response, that treatment should have been prioritized over incarceration, that mothers needed support rather than punishment, that children were better served by programs that kept families together rather than tearing them apart. We can acknowledge the racial dimensions of the crisis and the response, the ways in which Black and Hispanic mothers were treated more harshly than white mothers with similar problems. We can understand addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing, can offer empathy to those who struggled rather than judgment. But this understanding comes too late for those who lived through the 1980s, for the mothers who lost their children to foster care or their freedom to incarceration, for the children who grew up in chaos and carry the scars into their own adulthood, for the families that were destroyed by policies that claimed to protect them. The suffering was real, the consequences lasting, the opportunities for different outcomes squandered by a society that preferred punishment to compassion, that found it easier to condemn than to help, that looked at mothers struggling with addiction and saw threats rather than human beings in need of support. If there is a lesson to be drawn from this brutal chapter of history, it is that our responses to social problems reveal our values as a society. We can choose to approach addiction with empathy and evidence-based treatment, recognizing it as a health issue rather than a criminal justice matter. We can support families rather than separating them, providing resources that address root causes rather than simply removing children from difficult circumstances. We can acknowledge that mothers who struggle with addiction love their children no less than other mothers, that they deserve opportunities for recovery and reunification, that their humanity persists regardless of their struggles. The apartment is quiet now as the city outside begins its slow transition from night to morning. The child sleeps peacefully, unaware of the internal battles being fought just rooms away. You sit by the window, watching the sky lighten by degrees, thinking about tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that, about whether this will be the day things change or whether the cycle will continue unchanged. The weariness in your bones is profound, but so is the stubborn determination to keep going, to make it through one more day, to be there when your child wakes, to try again despite all the previous failures. And so you will rise when morning fully arrives, will put on the costume of functional motherhood, will navigate another day in a life that oscillates between crisis and brief moments of grace. You will make breakfast from inadequate supplies, will walk your child to school while hiding exhaustion behind a practiced smile, will return to an empty apartment and face the hours ahead with whatever resources you can muster. You will likely fail in small ways and perhaps large ways, will make choices driven by addiction that you will later regret, will disappoint yourself and your child and anyone who still cares enough to be disappointed. But you will also persist, because persistence is what mothers do, even mothers whose struggles are profound, even mothers whom society has written off as lost causes. The love you feel for your child is real and powerful, even when your actions do not reflect it adequately. The hope that tomorrow will be better is irrational but unextinguished. The possibility of change, however remote it may seem, remains as long as you remain. And so you will face another day in the brutal reality of being a crack-addicted mother in the 1980s, surviving because the alternative is unacceptable, loving imperfectly because it is the only way you know how, hoping desperately for a future that looks different than the present, even as you struggle to imagine how such a future might be achieved. The tools of Halloween mischief are not specialized equipment ordered from catalogs or purchased at seasonal stores. They are everyday items transformed by context and intention into instruments of chaos. A bar of soap, which in morning light is merely a tool for cleanliness, becomes by darkness a weapon of mass disfacement. An egg, which at breakfast is protein and possibility, becomes by evening a missile of sticky justice. Flour, the foundation of bread and sustenance, transforms into powder for warfare. This is the genius of Halloween pranking, the repurposing of the ordinary into the extraordinary, the elevation of household goods into legendary tools. Soap is the most democratic of pranking supplies because every home has it, every child can acquire it, and its use requires minimal skill while offering maximum satisfaction. The best soap for window decoration is white, firm, and slightly waxy. Ivory is preferred for its brightness and availability. Lifebuoy works but has a distinctive smell that can give away your identity. You take the bar in hand, testing its weight, and approach your target. The technique matters. Too much pressure and you get thick, opaque strokes that lack artistry. Too little pressure and the soap barely marks, forcing you to go over lines repeatedly and increasing your exposure time. The ideal is a smooth, confident stroke that leaves a clear white line visible from across the street. What you draw or write reveals much about your character and creativity. Some children are content with simple faces, circles for heads, dots for eyes, curves for smiling or frowning mouths. Others write messages, declarations of territory, or insults directed at occupants. The truly talented create elaborate scenes, entire narratives spread across multiple windows. A ship sailing across 3 panes of glass, a battle scene with stick figures wielding improbable weapons, words spelled in letters so ornate they approach calligraphy. By morning, the town becomes an unwilling art gallery, every soaped window a canvas, every message a tiny rebellion. The removal of soap from windows is its own ordeal, requiring hot water, rags, and sustained effort. Some soaps are water-soluble and come off easily. Others, especially those that have dried overnight and been baked by morning sun, achieve a permanence that approaches etching. Shopkeepers scrub and curse in equal measure, making mental notes about which children were seen in the vicinity, preparing for the inevitable confrontation at school or church where apologies will be demanded and grudgingly extracted. But even as they scrub, most adults remember their own youthful nights with soap in hand, and their anger is tempered by nostalgia. Eggs are more serious business because, unlike soap, eggs are permanent once they dry, and their smell develops character over time in ways that no one appreciates. An egg must be acquired, which means either bringing it from home and enduring the journey with pockets full of fragile shells, or liberating it from a convenient henhouse at risk of waking birds and farmers. Fresh eggs work best, having the optimal combination of weight and splash potential. Older eggs are lighter, their contents having evaporated slightly through porous shells, but they compensate with truly magnificent odors when broken. The throwing of an egg is a skill developed through practice. You must account for the egg's unusual aerodynamics, its tendency to tumble rather than spin, its fragility that means too hard a throw results in premature detonation in your own hand. The arc must be calculated to clear obstacles while still retaining enough velocity to break on impact. A well-thrown egg is a thing of beauty, sailing through the night air in a perfect parabola, illuminated briefly as it passes through pools of lamplight, before finding its target with a wet crack that sounds like applause. The ethics of egg throwing are debated endlessly among pranksters. Houses are generally acceptable targets, especially doors and walls. Windows are riskier because of the potential for actual damage if you miss your aim or throw with too much enthusiasm.
Vehicles are frowned upon, not from any sense of property respect, but because cars are harder to clean and their owners tend toward longer memories and greater vengeance. People are absolutely forbidden, crossing the line from prank into assault, though accidents happen when someone emerges from a building at precisely the wrong moment, and then apologies must be profuse and sincere if you wish to avoid genuine consequences. Flour is the atom bomb of Halloween pranking, capable of creating destruction on a scale that other tools cannot match. A sock filled with flour, knotted at the open end, becomes a bomb of startling effectiveness. Upon impact, the sock bursts, or if well made, simply poofs open, releasing a cloud of white powder that spreads in all directions, coating everything within a radius of several feet. The person at the center of a flour bomb detonation becomes a ghost against their will, covered head to toe in white dust that clings to hair, skin, and clothing with remarkable persistence. The problem with flour bombs is that they are indiscriminate. Throw one at a friend and you guarantee that you will also be covered, because flour clouds do not respect thrower-target distinctions. This mutually assured messiness keeps flour bomb usage somewhat in check, reserved for special occasions or moments when things have already escalated beyond the point of caring about personal cleanliness. The other problem is that flour is expensive relative to soap or eggs, a valuable food commodity in an era when nothing is wasted casually. Using flour for pranks rather than bread is a small act of rebellion against the values of thrift and practicality that govern daily life. When flour meets moisture, it creates paste, a substance with properties that make cleanup extraordinarily difficult. Flour in hair must be combed out over multiple washings. Flour on clothing sets in washing water, creating a starchy residue.
Flour on surfaces dries into a concrete-like layer that must be scraped rather than wiped. The morning after a flour attack, evidence persists for days, marking participants with a ghostly pallor that no amount of soap can entirely eliminate. Teachers learn to identify Halloween veterans by the white dust still visible in hairlines and ear crevices. Some pranksters develop specialty flour delivery systems. A flour bag balanced atop a partially opened door, ready to cascade down on whoever enters. Flour spread on porches where footprints will track it indoors. Flour launched from slingshots in small packets that explode mid-air like powder-filled fireworks. The creativity applied to flour distribution rivals that of any military R&D department, with each year bringing new innovations, new techniques, new ways to achieve maximum coverage with minimum flour expenditure. Rope and string are the infrastructure of complex pranks, the materials that enable elaborate setups and chain reaction chaos. String stretched across a dark path catches ankles and sends bodies sprawling. Rope tied between fence posts creates barriers. String attached to door handles and windows allows remote operation, letting pranksters trigger events from safe distances. The more sophisticated operators create systems of multiple strings, pulleys, and counterweights that would impress mechanical engineers. Pull string A and it releases catch B, which drops weight C, which pulls string D, which rings bell E, which startles cat F, which knocks over bucket G, which begins a cascade of events whose final outcome is hilarious or disastrous depending on your perspective and level of involvement. Tin cans and bells serve as alarm systems, noisemakers, and general chaos generators. Tied to strings and stretched across alleys, they create tripwires that announce intruders with rattling clangs. Attached to the backs of wagons or under porches, they produce mysterious sounds that frighten the superstitious. Hung from tree branches, they sway in the wind, creating ambient noise that adds to the general atmosphere of Halloween strangeness. Some pranksters collect cans and bells for weeks beforehand, building arsenals of noise-making equipment that will be deployed strategically across the town. Paint is rarely used because it crosses from prank into vandalism so clearly that even children recognize the distinction. But occasionally, someone finds a bucket of leftover whitewash or discovers that food coloring can be mixed into water to create temporary dyes. And then fences, posts, or even livestock find themselves transformed into colorful declarations of Halloween spirit. These incidents are remembered for years, partly because of their rarity, partly because they require significantly more effort to undo, and partly because there is something undeniably impressive about the commitment required to paint an entire chicken or dye a goat green.
The beauty of Halloween tools is their accessibility. A child with no money can still participate fully in the night's activities by liberating a bar of soap from the washroom, finding an egg or two, and fashioning string from household sources. The playing field is leveled not by wealth, but by creativity, courage, and the willingness to face consequences. The richest kid in town has no advantage over the poorest when both are armed with identical bars of ivory soap. The merchant's son and the farmhand's daughter stand equal before the blank canvas of an unsoaped window. For one night, the currency is not money, but imagination, and the rewards are measured in stories rather than dollars. By dawn, the tools are abandoned or hidden, waiting to be discovered by parents who will sigh and confiscate them, knowing, even as they do so, that next year will bring new tools, new plans, new configurations of soap and eggs and flour. The cycle is eternal, each generation discovering for themselves the transformative power of ordinary objects, the joy of repurposing the everyday into the extraordinary, the satisfaction of looking at a soaped window or a flower-bombed porch and thinking, "I did that. I left my mark. I was here." The outhouse tipping ceremony, for that is what it becomes, a ceremony, a ritual, a rite of passage, occupies a special place in Halloween tradition. It is simultaneously the most expected and most dreaded prank, the one that parents warn against and children plan for, the act that balances on the knife edge between harmless mischief and genuine transgression. To understand the significance of outhouse tipping is to understand the peculiar place outhouses occupy in 1920s life, structures that are simultaneously essential and embarrassing, private and vulnerable, dignified in their necessity and ridiculous in their exposure. An outhouse is a small wooden building, usually 4 feet by 4 feet, sometimes larger if the builder was generous or the family large. It sits at some distance from the main house, far enough that smells do not carry on summer breezes, but close enough that nighttime journeys are not expeditions. Inside is a bench with 1 or more holes, a supply of catalog pages or newspaper squares serving as tissue, and possibly a small window for light and ventilation.
The structure is designed to be functional rather than permanent, built without foundations, resting on runners or blocks that allow for periodic relocation when the pit beneath becomes full. This design feature, intended for practical purposes, has the unintended consequence of making the outhouse easy to tip. The physics are straightforward. The building is lightweight, constructed from thin boards. Its center of gravity is relatively high. It is not anchored to the ground. 3 or 4 determined teenagers can lift one side while others push, and the structure topples with surprising ease. The sound is distinctive, a wooden crash, a settling of boards, sometimes the tinkle of breaking glass if there was a window, and occasionally, if timing is truly unfortunate, a human scream as someone inside experiences a transition from privacy to chaos in the span of seconds. Planning an outhouse tipping begins weeks in advance for the serious practitioners. You scout your target neighborhood, noting which outhouses are isolated, which are visible from house windows, which are protected by dogs or fences or alert occupants. You assess the ground conditions, looking for soft earth that might make tipping easier or roots and rocks that might complicate the operation. You note the distances from escape routes, identifying which direction provides the quickest path to safety once the deed is done. Intelligence gathering extends to schedules, which families retire early, who stays up late, when the outhouse is most likely to be empty. On Halloween night, the outhouse tipping teams move with military precision. You approach from downwind so dogs do not catch your scent. You move silently, avoiding sticks and dry leaves that might crackle underfoot. One person is designated lookout, positioned where they can see the main house and signal if anyone emerges. The others surround the outhouse, taking positions on the sides designated for lifting and pushing. There is a moment of pause, a final check for occupancy, because even pranksters have standards, and then on a whispered count, the action begins. Lift on your side, push on the other. The outhouse resists at first, decades of settling making it reluctant to move. Then something gives, maybe a block shifts or the ground releases its hold, and suddenly the structure is in motion. It tilts past the point of balance, hangs for a moment in suspended animation, and then crashes down,
The impact is enormous, louder than you expected, and for a heartbeat, everyone freezes, certain that every adult in town heard and is already running toward you with flashlights and intentions to prosecute. But then the lookout signals all clear, and you are running, sprinting through the darkness, adrenaline and laughter mixing until you cannot tell them apart. Not every tipping goes smoothly. Sometimes the outhouse is heavier than anticipated, reinforced by a builder who knew what Halloween brings. Sometimes it is anchored with hidden weights or chains, a trap set by someone who remembers being young and foolish. Sometimes the ground is softer than it appeared, and instead of tipping cleanly, the outhouse sinks, or tilts at an awkward angle, or refuses to move at all despite your best efforts. These failures are remembered as vividly as successes, stories of attempted coups that ended in retreat, dignity bruised but intact. The worst-case scenario, the nightmare that haunts outhouse tippers, is the discovery that the building was occupied.
Despite all precautions and checks, someone was inside, perhaps having approached in silence, perhaps having been there all along, hoping to avoid detection during their vulnerable moment. The tipping proceeds, the crash comes, and then there is a yell, muffled from inside the overturned structure, followed by a more urgent scrambling as the occupant tries to extract themselves from what has become a horizontal coffin. Ethical tippers pause to ensure the person can escape and is not injured. Less ethical ones run immediately, adding another layer of guilt to their prank. Either way, the story spreads instantly. You tipped the outhouse with someone inside. Your legend is secure, even if your welcome in polite society is not. The victims of outhouse tipping face a morning of reckoning. The structure must be inspected for damage, then righted and repositioned, a process that requires help from neighbors or family members, and involves a level of physical intimacy with the outhouse that no one desires. If the pit was disturbed, additional complications arise that are best not examined in detail. The owners face choices: repair and strengthen for next year, or move the outhouse to a more defensible position, or simply accept that Halloween brings what it brings and plan to spend October 31st away from home. Some homeowners fight back preemptively. They surround their outhouses with fences, thorny bushes, or moats of uncertain depth. They install motion-activated bells or tripwires connected to alarms. The truly paranoid sleep in shifts, taking turns watching from darkened windows, ready to sally forth at the first sign of teenage approach. These defenses sometimes work, discouraging casual tippers and forcing them to seek easier targets. But they also serve as challenges to the more determined pranksters, whose honor demands they attempt what others consider impossible. There are legendary tales of outhouse tipping operations that achieved mythical status. The year someone tipped an entire row of outhouses simultaneously, requiring coordination between multiple teams and split-second timing. The Halloween when an outhouse was not merely tipped but relocated, carried 3 blocks away and positioned in front of the mayor's house. The night someone tipped an outhouse, righted it, rotated at 90 degrees, and left a note inside thanking the owner for their patience. These stories grow with each telling, details added and embellished, until the truth becomes irrelevant compared to the legend. As indoor plumbing spreads through towns and cities, the era of outhouse tipping gradually comes to an end. Modern bathrooms are built into houses, permanent and untippable, proof against even the most determined prankster. The tradition fades, mourned by some and celebrated by others, until it exists only in memory and in the stories told by elderly residents who remember when Halloween meant checking on your outhouse come morning and hoping it was still upright. But for those who lived through the golden age of outhouse tipping, the memory remains vivid. The weight of the structure as it began to move, the crash as it fell, the sprint through darkness with laughter catching in your throat, and the satisfaction of a prank executed to perfection. There comes a point on Halloween night when mischief escalates past pranks into something more concerning, when property damage stops being funny and starts being expensive, when the constable sets down his coffee and acknowledges that intervention is necessary. This is the moment when Halloween transforms from organized chaos into potential disaster, when broken windows must be counted, when trolley schedules are disrupted, when civic leaders wake in the morning wondering whether their town still qualifies as civilized.
Windows are simultaneously the most tempting and most problematic targets. A window is a barrier between inside and outside, a symbol of separation that invites breach. It is also expensive, fragile, and essential, which is why breaking windows crosses a line that even Halloween struggles to excuse. Yet every year, windows break. Sometimes it is accidental, a thrown egg that goes high and connects with glass instead of wall. Sometimes it is collateral damage, an outhouse tipped too close to a structure. And sometimes, regrettably, it is intentional, the work of pranksters who have lost sight of boundaries or who harbor genuine grudges that Halloween provides cover to express. The sound of breaking glass cuts through Halloween night with particular sharpness, a crystalline crash that carries differently than other noises, that makes adults sit up in bed and reach for robes and flashlights. A broken window is a violation that goes beyond inconvenience. It exposes interiors to weather and insects. It represents cost in an era when money is not casual. It signals that the social compact governing Halloween, the understanding that pranks will be tolerated within limits, has been breached.
Parents whose children are discovered to have broken windows face not just the cost of replacement, but social consequences, whispered conversations, and judgment that extends far past Halloween into the ordinary days that follow. Most window breaking is not malicious, but rather the result of poor judgment and overenthusiasm. A rock thrown at a door misses and continues upward. A stick wielded as a prop strikes glass instead of air. A prank involving climbing onto a roof to relocate a scarecrow results in someone losing balance and grabbing onto the nearest support, which happens to be a window frame. The perpetrators are often as horrified as the victims, sprinting away not from triumph, but from fear of consequences that will be severe and immediate. Stores suffer particularly because their windows are large, prominent, and filled with displays that represent investment and pride. The bakery window, showcasing morning's offerings, becomes an expensive casualty if hit. The general store's front glass, so carefully cleaned each morning, spiderwebs from impact and must be boarded until replacement arrives from the city, a process that takes weeks and serves as a constant reminder of Halloween's excesses. Shopkeepers know that some breakage is inevitable, budgeting for it as an informal Halloween tax, but each year they hope their establishment will be spared, and each year some are disappointed. The trolley system presents different problems because interference affects not just property but public service, transforming pranks into municipal incidents that draw official attention. Trolleys run on fixed tracks through town and between communities, powered by electricity from overhead lines, operated by drivers who follow careful schedules. The system represents progress and modernity, a source of civic pride, which makes it an irresistible target for Halloween troublemakers who see in it a challenge to be met. Tampering with trolley tracks is dangerous and illegal, which is why it is also exciting for teenagers whose judgment is not their strongest feature. The tracks can be obstructed with objects ranging from logs to pumpkins to, in one memorable incident, an entire wagon turned onto its side. The driver, navigating in darkness, may not see the obstacle in time, resulting in sudden stops that throw passengers forward or derailments that leave the trolley tilted at angles that require work crews and equipment to correct. That no one is seriously injured is more a matter of luck than planning. Track switches, which allow trolleys to change routes at intersections, can be manually operated if you know what you are doing or are willing to experiment. Flipping a switch sends the trolley onto an unexpected path, turning the intended route into an adventure that passengers did not sign up for. The driver, discovering that the tracks are leading somewhere unplanned, must stop, exit, and correct the switch, delaying the schedule and annoying everyone aboard who simply wanted to get home. Sometimes switches are flipped multiple times in a night, creating a chaos that paralyzes the system until morning allows for full inspection and reset. The overhead electrical lines that power trolleys are theoretically beyond reach, but not beyond ambition. Throwing objects at the lines, an activity known as wire fishing, attempts to disrupt the electrical connection or, at minimum, cause sparks that are visually impressive.
This is extraordinarily stupid and dangerous, carrying risks of electrocution or fire, but the visual reward of sparks showering down in the darkness draws attempters every year until someone is caught and made an example of, or until someone is hurt and the community collectively decides that perhaps this particular prank has gone too far. Occasionally, trolleys themselves are boarded by groups of pranksters who treat the vehicle as a mobile party, decorating the interior with flour, releasing chickens from bags, or rearranging seats and advertising cards. The driver, whose job description includes operating the trolley but not managing roving bands of teenagers, must decide whether to stop and attempt ejection, which may escalate the situation, or simply continue to the end of the line and report the incident, hoping that by morning someone will volunteer to clean the mess. Neither option is satisfying. The municipal response to serious Halloween vandalism is reactive and largely performative. The police department, stretched thin across the entire town, cannot be everywhere simultaneously. They position officers at known trouble spots, patrol in pairs, and respond to complaints with varying degrees of urgency depending on the severity of the report. A soaped window garners sympathy but no action. A broken window gets a visit and an investigation that may or may not lead anywhere. A trolley derailment brings serious attention, official reports, and promises that the perpetrators will be found and held accountable, though actually finding them among the dozens of potential suspects is detective work that exceeds the resources available. Arrests are rare because identifying culprits is difficult. Everyone was wearing masks. Everyone was moving in groups.
Witnesses are unreliable, either because they genuinely cannot tell one costumed figure from another, or because community loyalty prevents them from naming names even when they know exactly who did what. The constable or sheriff takes statements, writes reports, and files them, knowing that justice will likely come not through the legal system, but through social pressure, the disappointed looks and stern conversations, and quiet punishments that families administer internally when they discover their offspring have crossed lines. By morning, the damage is assessed. Windows are counted, repairs are scheduled, insurance claims are filed where insurance exists. The trolley company inspects its system, replacing broken parts and tightening security for next year. Town meetings are called where civic leaders decry the violence, though calling Halloween pranks violence is somewhat melodramatic, and promise action to prevent future excesses. Editorials are written, sermons are preached, parents are urged to supervise more closely, as if supervision has ever been effective at containing teenagers who have decided to embrace chaos. But underneath the official responses and public hand-wringing is a more complicated truth. Some of the damage was indeed too far, crossed from prank into vandalism, represented failures of judgment that deserve consequences. But most of it was simply Halloween expressing itself with more enthusiasm than wisdom, the predictable result of giving young people one night of loosened rules and then being surprised when they test exactly how loose those rules are. The broken windows will be replaced, the trolleys will run again on schedule.
And next October, the same civic leaders now decrying the chaos will brace themselves for it again, because Halloween, in all its broken glass glory, is now tradition, and traditions are not easily abandoned, even when they come with repair bills.
If you enjoy drifting through forgotten corners of history, where the familiar becomes strange and the past reveals itself in unexpected ways, consider joining us for more tales that unravel the threads of time. Tonight, we step into an era when Halloween was not the orderly parade of costumed children collecting candy that we know today, but something far wilder, far stranger, and infinitely more unpredictable. We are traveling back to the 1920s, to a time when October 31st marked the most dangerous, most chaotic, most thrilling night of the entire American year. Picture a world before plastic pumpkin buckets and store-bought costumes, before safety regulations and neighborhood watch programs, before parents walked their children door to door with flashlights and sensible shoes. Picture instead a night when darkness fell like a curtain on civility, when the rules that govern daily life were suspended by some unspoken agreement, when children and teenagers roamed the streets in wild packs, armed not with candy bags, but with bars of soap, sacks of flour, raw eggs still warm from the henhouse, and ambitions that ranged from harmless mischief to acts that would today warrant calls to the authorities.
This was Halloween in the Roaring Twenties, and it was glorious, terrifying, sticky, loud, and utterly unforgettable. The sun descends behind skeletal trees, their branches reaching toward a sky that deepens from violet to indigo to the kind of black that swallows sound. In towns across America, from the smallest farming villages to bustling city neighborhoods, a peculiar electricity charges the autumn air. It is not the electricity of modern life, humming through wires and lighting every corner with artificial brightness.
No, this is something older, something primal, the electricity of anticipation mixed with dread, of excitement tempered by the knowledge that before morning comes, something you value will likely be relocated, destroyed, or mysteriously transformed into a symbol of your defeat. You stand at your window, fingers curled around the edge of the curtain, peering out into the gathering darkness. Your yard looks innocent enough in the fading light. The fence stands where it always has, though you have already checked twice that the posts are secure. The flower beds, carefully tended through spring and summer, await their fate with the stoic resignation of soldiers before battle. Your mailbox, freshly painted just last week, gleams at the end of the drive, a beacon of order in a world about to descend into beautiful chaos. You have done what you can. The ladder is hidden in the cellar, the wagon is changed to the barn, the chickens are locked away with extra care, though you know from experience that determined children can pick a lock faster than you can say mischief night. Somewhere in the distance, you hear it. A giggle, high and bright, followed by a responding cackle, then silence. The kind of silence that makes your pulse quicken, because you know it means they are planning, plotting, moving through backyards and alleys with the stealth of creatures born to darkness. You glance at the clock. It is barely past sundown, and already it has begun. This is Halloween in 1923, and you are about to become part of a tradition that stretches back through decades. A tradition of chaos carefully cultivated, of boundaries playfully demolished, of property cheerfully redistributed according to rules that exist nowhere in any law book, but are understood by every child and grudgingly accepted by every adult. The history of this night is not written in official documents or preserved in museum displays. It lives in the memories of those who survived it, in the stories told and retold until they take on the quality of legend, in the faded newspaper articles that document with breathless alarm the annual descent into pandemonium. To understand 1920s Halloween is to understand a moment when America stood between two worlds, clinging to rural traditions even as cities grew and modernity pressed forward, when communities were small enough that everyone knew everyone, which meant both that you could not escape recognition and that forgiveness, eventually, was inevitable. Let us walk together through this strange landscape, through streets where shadows move with purpose and laughter echoes off brick walls, where the smell of wood smoke mingles with the sharper sense of crushed pumpkin and soap scum, where every porch light represents both an invitation and a dare. Let us meet the pranksters who plan their campaigns with military precision, the adults who defend their property with varying degrees of success, the animals who find themselves unwilling participants in nocturnal adventures, and the civic leaders who watch their orderly towns transform for one night into something resembling a very polite riot. Let us discover why this holiday, intended to honor the dead and mark the turning of seasons, became instead America's annual experiment in sanctioned anarchy, and why it took decades of effort to tame it into the relatively peaceful candy distribution system we know today. The night is young, the pranksters are gathering, and somewhere out there, a cabbage is about to fulfill its destiny in ways the farmer who grew it could never have imagined. Welcome to Halloween as it once was, in all its chaotic, sticky, glorious mayhem. The geography of a town matters differently on Halloween night. During daylight hours, Main Street is simply the place where shops cluster, where the bank anchors one corner and the post office holds down another, where mothers walk with shopping baskets and men tip their hats in greeting. The residential streets that branch away like tributaries are lined with modest houses, each with its patch of yard, its porch swing, its carefully tended garden.
The farms that ring the town proper are islands of agriculture, connected by dirt roads that turn to mud when it rains and dust when it does not. Everything has its place, its purpose, its ordered existence. But when October 31st arrives and darkness falls, the same geography transforms into a tactical landscape, a game board where every feature becomes significant in new ways. That alley between the hardware store and the dress shop, barely wide enough for two people to pass during the day, becomes a crucial escape route when you need to vanish before the shopkeeper emerges with his broom. The gap in the Henderson's fence, which everyone pretends not to notice, turns into a highway for pranksters moving between yards.
The oak tree that provides shade for summer picnics reveals itself to be the perfect observation post for spotting adult patrols. The covered bridge at the edge of town, romantic in daylight, becomes, after dark, a gathering point where plans are finalized and supplies distributed. Small towns suffer particularly from the peculiar intimacy that makes Halloween both more personal and more dangerous. In a city, you can soap a window and disappear into the anonymous crowd. In a town of 500 souls, everyone knows exactly who you are, where you live, and more importantly, where your parents can be found come morning. This should theoretically create accountability, a natural check on behavior. Instead, it creates something more interesting, a web of mutually assured embarrassment. You know that if you push things too far, your mother will hear about it before breakfast. But the victim also knows that if they complain too loudly, they risk being labeled a spoilsport, someone who cannot take a joke, someone who has forgotten that they too were young once and probably did worse. The main street of any town becomes a kind of neutral zone, too exposed for serious mischief, but perfect for the opening acts of the evening. Children parade in their homemade costumes, showing off for neighbors who exclaim over the creativity of a ghost made from flour sacks or a devil fashioned from red long johns and a cardboard tail. Adults stand in doorways, arms crossed, smiling despite themselves, remembering their own youth. The atmosphere is almost festive, almost innocent, but everyone knows this is merely the prelude. The real action will begin later, when the youngest children have been herded home to bed, when the streetlights cast more shadow than illumination, when the teenagers emerge with their carefully hoarded supplies and their elaborate plans. The residential streets are where the true battles will be fought. Every house becomes either a target or a fortress, sometimes both. You learn to read the signs. A dark house might mean the occupants have fled to relatives in the next county, abandoning their property to fate. Or it might mean they are lying in wait, ready to spring an ambush. A brightly lit porch could indicate a family prepared to negotiate with treats, hoping to buy their way out of trouble. Or it could be a trap, the light drawing you in while someone circles around behind. The houses of the elderly and infirm are theoretically off-limits, protected by an unwritten code. The houses of the notoriously grumpy, however, are marked for special attention. If you have spent all year yelling at children to get off your lawn, Halloween is when the lawn gets its revenge. Farms present unique opportunities and challenges. They are far from the watchful eyes of town constables, isolated enough that noise carries differently, spacious enough that a dozen pranksters can operate without tripping over each other. But they also have dogs, lots of dogs, and farmers who sleep lightly with shotguns within reach. The brave souls who venture out to farmhouses are either very clever or very foolish, and sometimes it is difficult to tell which until morning reveals whether they succeeded gloriously or retreated in disgrace. The town square, with its bandstand and benches and carefully maintained flower beds, represents the ultimate prize. To successfully prank the most public space in town is to achieve immortality in local legend. This is where you find the War Memorial, the town Christmas tree comes December, the place where civic pride concentrates. To decorate it with toilet paper, which is expensive and therefore rarely wasted on pranks, or to relocate unlikely objects to improbable heights is to make a statement. You were here. You dared. You succeeded.
The authorities will investigate with great seriousness, and the culprits, if caught, will be made examples of. But if you escape detection, the story will be told for years, growing more elaborate with each retelling until it becomes part of the town's mythology. Water towers and church steeples and school roofs are the Everest expeditions of Halloween pranking. They require planning, teamwork, equipment, and a healthy disregard for personal safety. Every year, someone attempts the impossible. Every year, the town wakes to find something perched where nothing should be able to perch. A wagon wheel, a scarecrow. Once, memorably, a goat, though how it got there remains one of history's great mysteries. These exploits are simultaneously condemned and admired, proof that the human spirit, especially the young human spirit, cannot be entirely contained by rules and expectations. As the evening progresses, the geography of the town becomes a living map of chaos. You can track the movement of prankster packs by following the trail of disturbances. Soap on the bakery windows means they came down Elm Street. An overturned trash can at the corner of 3rd and Main indicates they turned left. The sound of barking dogs tells you they have entered the Morrison property, unwisely, because the Morrisons have 3 very large, very enthusiastic hounds who consider chasing intruders to be the highlight of their existence. Adults attempting to coordinate defense efforts communicate in urgent whispers, trying to predict where the next strike will fall, but they are always one step behind, reacting to what has already happened, while the pranksters are 3 blocks away planning what comes next. By midnight, the town is transformed. What was orderly is now disheveled. What was predictable has become strange. Objects are in wrong places. Signs have been swapped. Gates hang from single hinges. Yet underneath the apparent chaos is a kind of pattern, the ghost of the community that will reassert itself come morning. Nothing is truly destroyed, merely rearranged. No one is genuinely hurt, merely inconvenienced. The geography of the town remains the same. Only the details have shifted, proof that for one night each year, the ordinary rules can be suspended, and the world will not end. In fact, it will laugh, shake its head, and begin the familiar ritual of putting things back where they belong, already anticipating next October when the map will be redrawn once more. The pranks of 1920s Halloween are not the sanitized tricks of later eras, the fake spider on a string or the whoopee cushion hidden under a chair. These are full-commitment productions requiring supplies, strategy, and often several accomplices. They range from the relatively harmless to the genuinely outrageous, united by a creative spirit that transforms everyday objects into instruments of chaos. If you can move it, you can relocate it. If you can tip it, you will tip it. If it belongs to someone who takes themselves too seriously, it becomes priority target number 1. The outhouse, that humble structure that represents both necessity and vulnerability, sits at the apex of the pranking pyramid. To tip an outhouse is not merely to inconvenience someone, it is to make a statement about the temporary nature of dignity, to remind everyone that we are all, in the end, subject to forces beyond our control. The physics are straightforward. The structure is lightweight, designed for function rather than stability. A determined group of 3 or 4 teenagers can lift one side while others push, and gravity does the rest. The sound it makes as it topples, a woody crash followed by the settling of disturbed earth, is uniquely satisfying. The aftermath, however, belongs to the realm of consequences best not examined too closely. Smart homeowners take precautions. They weight down their outhouses with sandbags. They position them against tree trunks or fence posts. They booby-trap the approaches with strategically placed rakes or pans filled with water. The truly paranoid move their families into town for the night, leaving only a note on the outhouse door. Already tipped. Better luck next year. This rarely deters anyone. The challenge becomes not whether to tip it, but how creatively it can be done. Can you tip it and then carry it to a new location? Can you tip an entire row of outhouses in coordinated fashion? Can you tip it gently enough that the occupant, if there is one, has time to exit with some shred of dignity intact? These are the questions that occupy young minds in the weeks leading up to Halloween. Gates and fences occupy the next tier of pranking targets. They are easy to remove, light enough to carry, and infinitely swappable. You take the gate from the Johnson's yard and install it at the Smith's house. The Smith's gate goes to the Williams family. The Williams Gate ends up at the church. By morning, no one can find their own property, and a committee must be formed to sort out the redistribution. Occasionally, gates disappear entirely, hidden in barns or buried in haystacks, to be discovered weeks or months later when they have passed from immediate concern into legend. Wagons are irresistible. They are mobile, yes, but not when you move them to places wagons should never go. Rooftops are the classic destination, achieved through a combination of pulleys, ramps, and sheer stubborn determination. The sight of a wagon perched on a barn roof at sunrise, wheels pointing skyward as if ready to drive across the clouds, never fails to draw a crowd. Variations include wagons in trees, wagons blocking doorways, and wagons disassembled and reassembled around objects, trapping them in wooden cages. The effort required is enormous, but the payoff in community astonishment makes it worthwhile. Soap is the artist's medium of Halloween. Every child carries at least one bar, usually Ivory or Lifebuoy, harvested from home washstands with varying degrees of parental knowledge. Windows are the primary canvas. You draw faces, write messages, create abstract designs that will require significant elbow grease to remove. The best soapers develop signature styles. Some favor intricate patterns. Others go for shock value with rude words. The truly talented can create elaborate scenes, entire narratives told in white waxy strokes across storefront glass. Shopkeepers wake to find their windows transformed into galleries, advertising everything from insults to marriage proposals to surprisingly accurate portraits of local dignitaries. Flour and eggs are the heavy artillery, saved for special targets or moments of escalation. A flour bomb, a sock filled with flour and tied shut, explodes on impact into a ghostly cloud that coats everything and everyone nearby. It is impossible to throw one without getting covered yourself, which adds an element of mutually assured destruction that keeps usage somewhat in check. Eggs are more precise, capable of being lobbed great distances with accuracy that improves with practice. A well-thrown egg can arc over a fence, clear a hedge, and splat against a door with a sound like a wet handshake. The smell that develops over the following days serves as a persistent reminder that Halloween has consequences. String and rope enable a whole category of booby trap pranks. Tie string across a path at ankle height and watch as people stumble in the darkness. Attach tin cans to string and drape them across doorways to create alarms. Use rope to tie doors shut, trapping occupants inside until they can find scissors. The most elaborate setups involve multiple strings and pulleys, creating chain reactions where pulling one string causes a bucket to tip, which releases a ball, which rolls down a ramp, which rings a bell, which wakes the dog, which chases the cat, which knocks over the milk, which creates a mess that no one can quite explain come morning. Vegetables, especially cabbages and turnips, serve as both projectiles and sculptural materials. Their abundance in October makes them readily available, and their heft makes them satisfying to throw. But creative pranksters go further, building pyramids of cabbages on porches, lining walkways with turnips, creating vegetable sculptures in town squares. The cabbage is particularly versatile. It rolls when thrown downhill, gaining speed and wreaking havoc. It can be hollowed out and worn as a helmet. It survives impact well enough to be thrown repeatedly. And when the prank is done, it can be returned to the garden or the compost pile, having served its higher purpose. The relocation of objects is an art form unto itself. Anything not nailed down is considered fair game. Signs are swapped between businesses. The butcher's shingle ends up at the dress shop. The pharmacy's mortar and pestle find themselves advertising the hardware store. Flower pots migrate from yard to yard. Scarecrows go on adventures, appearing in unexpected places wearing unexpected accessories. The town wakes to find its familiar landscape subtly altered. Everything slightly wrong, like a photograph where someone has moved all the furniture 3 inches to the left. And then there are the legendary pranks, the ones that require such coordination and audacity that they pass immediately into folklore. The year someone filled the school bell tower with hay. The night the entire contents of the general store's front window were rearranged to spell an extremely rude word. The Halloween when every chicken in town was dyed green, though no one ever discovered how or why. These are the stories told and retold, embellished with each telling, until it becomes impossible to separate truth from legend. But that is part of the magic. On Halloween, the impossible becomes possible, if only for one night. Candy, as we know it on Halloween, does not truly exist yet in the 1920s. There are no fun-sized bars, no miniature packets of chocolate engineered for maximum distribution, no plastic pumpkin buckets designed to hold 5 pounds of sugar. The treat component of trick-or-treat is still emerging, still finding its form, and what emerges from the doors of 1920s homes is a strange assortment of homemade offerings, fresh produce, and occasionally items that make you question whether the giver understood the assignment. The children who brave the night in hopes of treats do not arrive at doors with cheerful chants and adorable costumes. They arrive in packs, faces obscured by flour sacks with eye holes cut at questionable angles, knocking with a force that suggests the door should open immediately. The homeowner who answers faces a choice: provide something, anything, that might satisfy these creatures, or risk becoming the focus of the evening's more destructive energies. It is protection money, essentially, paid in sugar and starch. Taffy is ubiquitous because it is cheap to make and stretches a long way, literally and figuratively. Every household has a molasses-based recipe, usually involving butter, sugar, and optimism. The taffy is pulled, cut into pieces, wrapped in wax paper, and handed out with pride. What the makers do not mention is that their taffy has the consistency of welding compound and the flavor of sweetened glue. Children accept it with feigned enthusiasm, wait until they are out of sight, and then face the decision of whether to actually eat it or repurpose it as emergency building material. Some taffy survives until Thanksgiving, gradually petrifying in jacket pockets until it reaches a density that defies scissors.
Popcorn balls represent an attempt at festivity. Popped corn pressed together with syrup or molasses, formed into spheres of varying size and uniformity, they look cheerful and seasonal. The reality is that they are nearly impossible to eat without losing at least one filling. The best strategy is to lick them slowly over the course of several hours, though this is deeply unsatisfying and leaves your face sticky for days. Many popcorn balls end their lives as ammunition in impromptu food fights or as offerings to livestock who refuse them on principle. Apples appear with alarming frequency, as if the adults have collectively decided that children need fiber more than they need fun. A fresh apple is at least useful. A suspicious apple, soft in places, wrinkled from weeks in storage, bearing marks that suggest it has been sampled by something with teeth, is an insult wrapped in fruit skin. Children accept them because refusal is unwise, then dispose of them in creative ways. Bushes are popular depositories. So are the yards of people who gave you the apples in the first place, completing a circle of passive-aggressive horticulture. The rare, the precious, the legendary chocolate bar appears so infrequently that its emergence from a doorway causes actual excitement. A real candy bar, factory-made, wrapped in paper, containing actual chocolate rather than carob or some other apologetic substitute, is worth its weight in gold. Children memorize which houses distribute chocolate and prioritize them on future Halloween routes. These homes are protected by an invisible shield. No one soaps their windows, no one touches their gates. Some traditions are sacred. Cookies and baked goods occupy a middle ground. A freshly baked cookie, still slightly warm, handed over with a smile, is a treasure. A cookie that has been sitting uncovered on a shelf for an indeterminate period, gathering flavors from its environment, is less desirable. Children develop a sixth sense for evaluating baked goods. If the cookie looks homemade and the house smells like vanilla, accept with gratitude. If the cookie looks homemade but the house smells like cabbage, proceed with caution. Some cookies are so hard they could be used as poker chips. Others are so soft they disintegrate upon touch, leaving you holding crumbs and regret. Then there are the novelty items, the treats that make you wonder what the giver was thinking. A potato, a raw turnip, a crust of bread with butter, a single walnut still in its shell. These are not treats so much as statements, messages from adults who either lack resources or possess highly developed senses of humor. In rare cases, they are tests. If you can accept a potato with grace and gratitude, you have passed some kind of character evaluation. If you throw the potato back at the house, you have failed, and your reputation suffers accordingly. The truly diabolical givers employ the caramel onion,
A Halloween tradition so cruel it borders on psychological warfare. You take an onion and dip it in caramel until it is indistinguishable from a caramel apple. The child who bites into it experiences a journey from anticipation through confusion to betrayal that shapes their worldview for years to come. There is no defense except vigilance and a willingness to let someone else take the first bite. The truly diabolical givers employ the caramel onion, a Halloween tradition so cruel it borders on psychological warfare. You take an onion and dip it in caramel until it is indistinguishable from a caramel apple. The child who bites into it experiences a journey from anticipation through confusion to betrayal that shapes their worldview for years to come. There is no defense except vigilance and a willingness to let someone else take the first bite.
Occasionally, homes hand out nuts still in their shells, which are nutritious and boring, or pieces of fudge that are either delicious or vaguely poisonous, depending on the skills of the maker. There is no way to know until you risk a taste. Some fudge is transcendent, the kind of confection that makes you believe in human goodness. Other fudge has the texture of sand and the flavor of mistakes. You learn to read the signs. If the giver seems overly eager for you to try it immediately, suspicion is warranted. By the end of the night, children sort through their hauls with the intensity of prospectors panning for gold. The chocolate bars are set aside for immediate consumption. The acceptable cookies form a second tier. The questionable items are evaluated for tradability. The apples are sentenced to bush exile. The taffy is placed in a drawer where it will remain, fossilizing until someone moves houses and discovers it decades later, still sticky despite the passage of time. And the memories of knocking on doors not knowing what would emerge, of the strange lottery that was Halloween treats. Those remain long after the last popcorn ball has been either eaten or repurposed as a paperweight. The costumes of 1920s Halloween are not purchased from stores offering complete ensembles with matching accessories. There are no vampire capes with attached collars, no pre-printed superhero suits, no licensed character masks. Every costume is an act of creation, cobbled together from household items, limited by imagination only to the extent that imagination is limited by what can be found in attics, closets, and rag bags. The result is a strange parade of improvised identities, creatures and characters rendered in bedsheets and flour sacks, held together with safety pins, hope, and occasionally actual twine. The ghost is the universal costume, available to anyone with access to a white sheet and scissors. You drape the sheet over your head, mark where your eyes fall, cut 2 holes of approximately correct size, though rarely in perfectly aligned positions, and you are transformed. The effect is more awkward than frightening. Vision is limited to 2 circular tunnels of sight. Breathing becomes complicated. Walking without tripping requires concentration. But you are a ghost, and that is what matters. Some ambitious ghost makers cut additional holes for arms, though this risks being mistaken for a very pale, very poorly made dress. Others add chains or carry lanterns, accessories that transform the simple ghost into the ghost of Jacob Marley or some other specific spirit, though most people miss the reference. Witches are popular, especially among girls, because the costume requires only a broom, a hat fashioned from stiff paper or cardboard, and some creativity with facial coloring. Charcoal from the stove provides instant wrinkles and warts. A shawl or dark coat completes the ensemble. The broomstick is both prop and potential weapon, useful for maintaining personal space in crowds. Some witches cackle convincingly. Others simply sweep menacingly at anyone who gets too close. The effect is the same. You are witchy, and everyone understands what you represent, even if the execution is somewhat abstract. Devils are equally common, particularly among boys who appreciate the implicit permission to be mischievous.
A devil requires something red, which can be long underwear, a shirt, or in desperate cases, red paint applied directly to skin, with consequences that will become apparent over the following days when it refuses to wash off entirely. Horns are fashioned from paper, wire, or carved vegetables. A tail can be made from rope, a stocking stuffed with newspaper, or a strip of fabric attached to the back of the pants with alarming insecurity. Pitchforks are sometimes genuine farm tools borrowed without explicit permission, other times constructed from sticks and cardboard, and occasionally forgotten in yards where they will be discovered months later by confused homeowners. Animals are attempted with varying degrees of success. Cat costumes require black clothing if available, ears made from triangles of paper or felt, whiskers drawn with burnt cork or eyeliner stolen from an older sister, and a tail that drags behind you collecting dirt and debris. Dog costumes follow similar principles, but with different ear shapes.
Rabbits need white or gray colors and extremely long ears, which prove structurally challenging and usually end up bent or torn before the evening is half over. The occasional child attempts a mouse, a bear, or something more exotic, though these often result in costumes so abstract that multiple explanations are required throughout the night, each one less convincing than the last. Pirates are ambitious projects. You need a hat, which can be folded from newspaper, an eye patch made from cloth and string, some manner of sword or knife, which is usually wooden or cardboard, and an attitude of lawlessness that most children find easy to channel on Halloween. A vest, a sash, boots if you are fortunate, and the willingness to say "R" in response to most questions complete the transformation. The best pirates add details like drawn-on scars or missing teeth, achieved by temporarily blacking out existing teeth with grease pencil or by simply keeping your mouth closed. Clowns appear occasionally, though they require makeup skills beyond what most households possess. Flour serves as white base. Lipstick, borrowed and unlikely to be returned in usable condition, creates the exaggerated mouth. Charcoal adds eyebrows. The result is usually less professional circus clown and more fever dream apparition, but children lack the self-consciousness to care. A colorful outfit, oversized shoes achieved by wearing adult footwear or simply shuffling, and a red nose made from paper complete the ensemble. The fact that 1920s clowns are somehow more unsettling than their modern counterparts is rarely remarked upon at the time, but becomes apparent when viewing surviving photographs. Occasionally, someone attempts historical or political figures. Abraham Lincoln is recognizable if you are tall and can fashion a stovepipe hat. George Washington requires white hair, achieved through flour or powder, and a general air of dignity difficult to maintain while soaping windows. Local politicians are parodied through exaggerated features and known quirks, though this carries risks if the politician in question is identified and takes offense. The masks available for purchase are limited and frightening in ways that transcend Halloween spookiness. Made from brittle cardboard or stiff paper, painted with industrial chemicals that smell of regret, featuring eye holes that align with no known human face structure, these masks transform wearers into creatures of nightmare. Breathing is restricted. Vision is compromised. The edges cut into your skin. But they are store-bought, which carries prestige, and they are undeniably disturbing, which serves the purpose. Common designs include generic devils with red faces and black beards, witches with green skin and impossible noses, skulls that are anatomically questionable, and animal faces that seem to represent no specific animal, but rather some platonic ideal of animalness. By evening's end, costumes are in tatters. Ghost sheets are torn from encounters with fences. Witch hats are crushed from being sat upon. Devil tails have detached and been lost to the night. Makeup has smeared into abstract patterns. Masks have been abandoned as the discomfort outweighed the effect. But for a few hours, ordinary children were transformed into creatures of imagination, granted permission to be someone or something else, freed from the constraints of daily identity. The costumes may have been crude, but the transformation was real. And is that not the true magic of Halloween? The ability to step outside yourself and discover that the world looks different from behind a flour sack mask, that boundaries shift when you are dressed as a devil, that even the most homemade costume carries within it a small portion of actual magic? The breakfast table becomes a theater of small negotiations and silent compromises.
Your child sits with legs swinging, not quite reaching the floor, spooning cereal with the focus that only children can bring to simple tasks. You watch them eat, mentally calculating how many more breakfasts the current box will provide, whether you can stretch the milk another day by diluting it slightly with water, a trick your own mother used and one you swore you would never employ with your own children. Yet here you are, making the same calculations, the same compromises, trapped in patterns that repeat across generations despite the best intentions. The television provides its constant companionship, a parade of cheerful faces selling products you will never buy, telling stories about families whose problems resolve neatly within 30 minutes. Your child absorbs these narratives without questioning them, learning a version of normalcy that bears little resemblance to the reality they inhabit. You wonder sometimes what impact this will have, whether they will grow up feeling their own life is somehow less legitimate because it does not match the scripted perfection of television families. You want to explain that those stories are not real, that everyone struggles in ways not shown on screen, but you lack the words to articulate this without revealing too much about your own struggles. The morning routine continues with the brush of teeth using a toothbrush that should have been replaced weeks ago, the struggle to comb through hair that tangled during sleep, the search for socks that match or at least come close enough to pass. Your child complains about the clothes you have selected, wanting instead the shirt that is somewhere in the laundry pile awaiting washing. You negotiate, offering alternatives, eventually prevailing through a combination of reason and parental authority, though the victory feels hollow given the trivial nature of the battle. The walk to school takes you past familiar landmarks, each carrying its own associations and memories. The corner where dealers typically stand is empty at this hour, though you know they will appear later, conducting their business with the efficiency of any retail operation. The bodega with its barred windows and suspicious owner who watches every customer as though they are potential thieves. The abandoned lot where neighborhood children play despite the broken glass and questionable debris, creating games from nothing because imagination flourishes even in environments designed to crush it. Other parents are out walking their children as well, a parade of families navigating the same streets with varying degrees of ease. Some parents are dressed for office jobs, carrying briefcases and wearing professional clothing that marks them as people who have managed to cling to middle-class status despite living in this neighborhood. Others are clearly heading to service jobs, wearing uniforms for fast food restaurants or cleaning companies, employment that pays barely enough to survive but not enough to escape.
Still others are like you, dressed in whatever was available, their employment status uncertain, their daily schedules flexible in the way that suggests either freedom or lack of structure depending on one's perspective. The school crossing guard knows your child by name, offering a cheerful greeting that your child returns with enthusiasm. You feel grateful for this person who provides a moment of recognition and care, who makes your child feel seen and valued. These small kindnesses matter more than people realize, creating islands of warmth in a sea of indifference. You make a mental note to thank the crossing guard properly someday, perhaps with cookies or a card, gestures you never quite manage to follow through on because the demands of each day consume all available energy. Inside the school gates, children swarm in all directions, their voices creating a cacophony of excitement and chaos. Your child spots friends and runs off after a quick hug, leaving you standing alone among the other parents who are beginning to disperse. You linger for a moment, watching your child disappear into the building, seized by a sudden fear that something will happen, that you will never see them again, that the fragile structure of your life will collapse before you can return for pickup. These fears are irrational, you know, products of anxiety and guilt, but they feel real in the moment, requiring conscious effort to dismiss. The walk home is quieter, the streets less populated now that the morning rush has passed. You move slowly, in no hurry to return to the empty apartment, dreading the hours that stretch ahead with no structure and too much time to think.
The cravings that you manage to suppress during the morning routine begin to assert themselves, a physical sensation that starts in your chest and radiates outward, creating restlessness and discomfort that will only intensify as the day progresses. You know where this is heading, can predict with depressing accuracy how the next few hours will unfold, yet you continue walking as though there is some possibility of a different outcome. The apartment greets you with its familiar smell, a combination of stale air, cooking odors, and something indefinable that marks it as home despite its inadequacies. You move through the rooms mechanically, picking up toys and placing them in baskets, carrying dishes to the sink, straightening cushions on the couch, engaged in the domestic rituals that create an illusion of order. The radio plays quietly, a morning talk show discussing topics that seem to emanate from a different universe, problems so divorced from your reality that they might as well be theoretical constructs rather than genuine concerns. The telephone rings, a sound that always triggers anxiety because calls rarely bring good news. You approach it cautiously, checking the caller identification if such technology is available, or simply letting it ring if you cannot face whatever message awaits. Sometimes it is a creditor demanding payment on debts that have long since become unmanageable, employing tactics that range from professional courtesy to outright harassment depending on how many payment deadlines have been missed. Sometimes it is family members checking in with questions that are really assessments, trying to determine whether your situation has deteriorated further, whether intervention is needed, whether they should be worried or merely disappointed.
Sometimes the calls are from the school, reporting that your child is sick or has been injured on the playground, requiring you to arrange pickup and care despite having no sick leave from work, no backup plan for childcare emergencies, no margin in your schedule for unexpected crises. These calls fill you with dread, not because you lack concern for your child's well-being, but because each crisis exposes the inadequacy of your resources, the ways in which your inability to provide stable employment and reliable transportation creates cascading problems that mothers with more resources handle as minor inconveniences. On days when there are no immediate crises demanding attention, the hours between school drop-off and pickup stretch interminably. If you have work scheduled, you prepare for that, gathering whatever items are needed, checking bus schedules, or arranging rides, mentally preparing for hours of labor that will leave you exhausted and barely compensated. If there is no work, the day becomes a challenge of filling time without spending money, finding activities that will keep you occupied and distracted from the cravings that intensify in idleness. The public library becomes a refuge on some days, a place where you can sit in air conditioning during summer or warmth during winter, surrounded by books that offer escape into other lives and other times. You browse the shelves randomly, pulling volumes based on covers or titles that catch your eye, reading passages while seated in chairs designed for study and contemplation. The library enforces quiet, creating an atmosphere of calm that contrasts sharply with the chaos of your apartment and neighborhood.
Here, you can pretend to be someone else, a person whose life includes leisure time for reading, whose interests extend beyond immediate survival. The librarians come to recognize you, noting your regular presence, occasionally recommending books they think you might enjoy. These interactions are brief and professional, yet they carry a warmth that you rarely experience elsewhere. The library asks nothing of you except basic courtesy, judges you not at all, provides resources freely to anyone who enters, regardless of their circumstances or struggles. It represents a vision of what public institutions could be, serving communities without demanding proof of worthiness, offering knowledge and comfort as rights rather than privileges to be earned. Yet even the library cannot fully distract from the cravings that grow more insistent as the morning becomes afternoon. Your leg bounces unconsciously, your attention drifts from the pages you are attempting to read. Your mind begins to calculate how you might obtain money for a purchase, who you could call, where you might go. The internal debate begins again, the same arguments rehearsed countless times. Your rational mind listing all the reasons to resist, while another part of your consciousness advocates for just one use, just enough to take the edge off. Promises that this time will be different, that you will maintain control. The dealers are not difficult to find, their locations known to anyone who has lived in the neighborhood for any length of time. They operate with a semi-permanence that suggests either corruption or indifference on the part of law enforcement, standing on corners or in doorways, conducting transactions with an efficiency born of repetition.
The relationship between dealer and user is peculiar, simultaneously commercial and parasitic, marked by a false friendliness that masks the fundamental transaction of money for drugs. Your dealer knows your name, asks about your child, extends credit when you are short, all while profiting from your addiction and having no genuine investment in your well-being. The purchase itself is quick, a matter of seconds, money and product exchanged with practiced discretion. You pocket the small plastic bag or vial, already anticipating the relief that is now guaranteed, the tension in your body easing slightly just from knowing that use is imminent. The walk back to your apartment is purposeful, no longer aimless wandering, but movement toward a specific destination and goal. Other pedestrians seem oblivious to your mission, though perhaps some recognize the particular urgency in your stride, the telltale signs of someone who has just scored and is heading home to use. Back in the apartment, the ritual of preparation begins. The pipe must be retrieved from wherever it was hidden, cleaned if necessary, the small rock of crack cocaine positioned carefully. A lighter is needed, the flame applied to the rock while you inhale through the pipe, the vapor harsh in your throat and lungs. The effects are almost immediate, a rush of euphoria and energy that floods your system, making everything seem suddenly manageable, problems shrinking to insignificance, confidence surging. For these few minutes, you are not a struggling single mother drowning in poverty and addiction, but rather someone powerful and capable, someone who has answers rather than questions, someone who is enough. The high is intensely physical, your heart racing, your senses heightened, a feeling of invincibility coursing through your body. You move around the apartment with sudden energy, perhaps cleaning with manic intensity, or talking rapidly to yourself, or simply pacing as your system processes the drug. Ideas and plans flood your mind, solutions to problems that have seemed intractable, visions of how you will change your life starting tomorrow or next week or soon. These plans feel completely achievable in the moment, backed by a confidence that seems unshakable, though experience should have taught you that this confidence is chemically induced and will evaporate as the drug leaves your system. The duration of the high is cruelly brief, 10 or 15 minutes at most before the euphoria begins to fade, replaced by a restless discomfort and an immediate craving for more. This is the trap of crack cocaine, the way it creates an intense desire for repeated use, each high followed quickly by a crash that makes the next use seem necessary just to feel normal again. If you have money for additional purchases, the cycle repeats, each use slightly less satisfying than the last, chasing a high that cannot be recaptured, using not for euphoria, but to avoid the discomfort of being sober. If you have no money for additional purchases, the crash is harder, the come down marked by depression and anxiety and physical exhaustion. Your body aches, your mind races with negative thoughts, the problems you briefly forgot return with added weight. The guilt arrives in force, condemning you for using again, for spending money needed elsewhere, for choosing drugs over your child's needs, for being weak and selfish and everything else you tell yourself in moments of self-recrimination. You might cry, overwhelmed by the hopelessness of your situation, or you might simply stare at nothing, too depleted to even properly despair. The hours following use are lost time, periods when you are neither high enough to feel good nor sober enough to be functional, existing in a liminal state that serves no purpose. If your child were home, this would be when your inadequacy as a parent would be most visible, your inability to engage or care for them properly, your presence more burden than help. The fact that they are at school provides a small mercy, time for you to cycle through the use and crash without witnesses, to pull yourself together before you must present as a responsible adult. The clock becomes your enemy and your salvation, marking the passage of time towards school pickup, creating a deadline by which you must achieve some semblance of normalcy. You force yourself to shower, washing away the sweat and smoke smell, brushing your teeth multiple times to eliminate any chemical taste. You drink water and eat something if possible, trying to stabilize your system. You check your appearance in the mirror, assessing whether you look acceptable enough to appear in public, whether teachers or other parents will notice anything amiss. The walk back to school retraces your morning route, though you are now a different person than you were hours earlier, changed by the cycle of use and crash, carrying additional guilt and shame to add to the burden you already bear. The cravings have subsided temporarily, replaced by exhaustion and a flatness of affect that makes everything seem slightly unreal. You join the other parents gathering outside the school, positioning yourself apart from the main groups, not quite belonging to any social circle, marked by your isolation even in a crowd. When your child emerges from the building, their face lights up with uncomplicated joy at seeing you, a reaction that simultaneously warms your heart and breaks it. They run toward you with news to share about their day, unaware of your state, trusting that you are present and interested and capable of providing what they need. You listen to their chatter, responding appropriately, playing the role of engaged parent while internally you are struggling to maintain focus, fighting the exhaustion that makes every interaction effortful. The afternoon at home is dedicated to homework and dinner preparation, the routines of family life that continue regardless of your internal state. Your child spreads schoolwork across the kitchen table, requiring help with math problems or spelling words, tasks that should be simple, but that require concentration you are struggling to maintain. You do your best, praising their efforts, helping where you can, hiding the fact that you are barely functioning, that maintaining this facade of normalcy is consuming all your remaining energy. Dinner is improvised from whatever is available, perhaps pasta with jarred sauce, or rice and beans, or sandwiches if you are too tired for actual cooking. Your child eats hungrily, their appetite healthy and normal, while you pick at your own food, your stomach unsettled, your appetite suppressed by the residual effects of the crack cocaine.
The television provides background noise, cartoons or sitcoms that your child watches with attention while you stare through the screen, your mind elsewhere, processing the day's events and dreading the evening ahead. Bath time and bedtime follow dinner, the sequence of events so routine that you can navigate them on autopilot. The bathwater runs while you gather pajamas and towels, the temperature tested with your hand to ensure it is neither too hot nor too cold. Your child plays in the water, creating scenarios with plastic toys, their imagination transforming the bathtub into an ocean or a space station, or whatever context their games require. You supervise with half your attention, your responses to their commentary automatic, while your mind drifts to thoughts of the evening stretching ahead once they are asleep. The bedtime story is selected from a small collection of books, tales you have read so many times that you could recite them from memory. Your child snuggles against you as you read, their body warm and trusting, their breathing gradually slowing as sleep approaches. These moments are precious, times when your love for them is uncomplicated by guilt or shame, when you are simply a mother providing comfort to her child. You linger over the story, drawing out this peaceful interlude, reluctant to reach its conclusion and move forward into the more difficult hours of the evening. After your child is asleep, the apartment becomes simultaneously more peaceful and more threatening. The absence of immediate demands on your attention leaves space for the cravings to resurface, for the internal debate to resume about whether you will use again tonight.
If you have money and access to more drugs, the temptation is nearly overwhelming, the promise of relief from the discomfort and depression of the come-down almost impossible to resist. If you have no money, you might spend hours trying to find some, searching through pockets and couch cushions, considering who you might call to borrow from, contemplating actions you would normally find unthinkable. The night hours are when the full weight of your situation becomes most apparent, when the distractions of daily routine fall away and you are left alone with your thoughts and your choices. You sit in the dark apartment, smoking cigarettes by the window, watching the street below where life continues despite the hour. Cars pass, their headlights creating moving patterns of light and shadow. People walk by, some alone and some in groups, heading to or from destinations you can only guess at. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wail, the soundtrack of the city at night, emergency and crisis unfolding constantly across the urban landscape. Your thoughts during these hours circle endlessly through the same territory, examining your situation from every angle without ever arriving at solutions. You think about your child and the life you are providing, comparing it to the childhood you wish you could give them, cataloging all the ways you are failing. You think about your own childhood, searching for explanations for how you arrived at this point, wondering if your parents felt similar despair, whether this struggle is generational or specific to your own choices. You think about the future, trying to imagine how things might change, what it would take to achieve stability and recovery, whether such change is even possible given the depth of your addiction and poverty. The television offers escape from these thoughts, late-night programming that requires no mental engagement,
channels surfed through aimlessly until something captures your attention enough to provide distraction. Old movies, infomercials, talk shows featuring guests discussing problems that seem trivial compared to your own. Music videos with their glossy depictions of wealth and beauty and success. You watch with the detachment of exhaustion, the images washing over you without leaving impressions, simply filling time until sleep becomes possible or morning arrives, whichever comes first. Sleep itself is elusive and unsatisfying, a series of brief unconscious periods interrupted by waking, by thoughts that will not quiet, by physical discomfort or anxiety, or the sounds of the building and neighborhood. You drift in and out, never fully resting, your body trying to recover from the day's drug use while your mind continues racing. Dreams, when they come, are often disturbing, distorted versions of your waking concerns, scenarios of loss and failure played out in the logic-free theater of the unconscious mind. You wake from these dreams with your heart pounding, momentarily disoriented, taking several seconds to remember where you are and that the dream was not real. The weekends present their own challenges. 48 hours when your child is home constantly, requiring supervision and entertainment, removing your ability to use drugs during the day without their awareness. Some mothers are skilled at compartmentalizing, managing to use while maintaining the facade of normal parenting, employing babysitters or relatives, or simply hiding their use effectively.
Others find weekends nearly impossible, the enforced sobriety highlighting how dependent they have become, the hours crawling by as they wait for Monday when the normal routine will resume. Activities that cost little or nothing become weekend staples. The playground, if weather permits, though you must remain alert to the various dangers present even in spaces designed for children. The library for books and air conditioning, your child selecting picture books while you browse magazines or simply sit. The free concerts or festivals that occasionally happen in public spaces, opportunities to be among crowds and activity, to feel part of the community, even if you are merely observing from the edges. Your own relatives, if you maintain contact with them, might provide occasional respite, inviting your child for visits that allow you a few hours of freedom. These invitations come with judgment, explicit or implied, questions about your life and choices that you deflect with practiced vagueness. Family gatherings are ordeals to be endured, events where your failure is evident in comparison to siblings or cousins who have achieved stability, who own homes and hold steady jobs, and whose children participate in activities like soccer leagues and music lessons. You attend when you cannot avoid it, leaving as early as socially acceptable, returning to your apartment with relief despite its inadequacies. The changing seasons mark time's passage in ways that the calendar cannot quite capture. Summer brings heat that makes the unair-conditioned apartment unbearable, temperatures that drive you to parks or libraries or anywhere that offers relief.
Your child complains about being hot, and you do what you can with fans and cold water, creating makeshift water play in the bathtub or outside with a hose if your building permits. The long daylight hours mean your child stays awake later, compressing the time you have alone in the evenings, making it more difficult to use drugs without risk of discovery. Autumn brings the return to school routine, new teachers and new challenges, the need for school supplies and clothing as your child has grown over the summer. The mornings become darker, sunrise arriving later, making it harder to wake and begin the day. You notice your child's friends starting activities, joining sports teams or scouts, or after-school programs that require fees you cannot afford and transportation you cannot provide. Your child begins to understand that their life differs from their peers, that other families have resources and opportunities unavailable to them, and you see the beginning of awareness in their eyes, the first questioning of why things are this way. Winter is perhaps the hardest season, the cold making every aspect of life more difficult. Heating bills rise while your ability to pay them does not, leading to apartments that are perpetually cold, to layering clothing and huddling under blankets, to fears of utilities being shut off. Your child gets sick more frequently, colds and flu that spread through school, requiring care and medicine you struggle to afford. The early darkness makes evenings feel longer, more hours to fill, more time for cravings to intensify. The holidays approach with their promise of joy and their reminder of inadequacy, expectations of gifts and celebrations that mock your poverty. Christmas, in particular, becomes a gauntlet of shame and effort.
Your child writes letters to Santa Claus, listing desired toys seen in commercials, unaware that Santa's generosity correlates directly with family income. You search thrift stores and toy drives, accepting charity that stings your pride even as you are grateful for it. On Christmas morning, you present the modest haul with enthusiasm, watching your child's face for disappointment or acceptance, hoping the gifts are enough to create a happy memory despite their secondhand nature. The arrival of spring brings relief from winter's harshness, warming temperatures and longer days, nature's annual resurrection offering its metaphor for hope and renewal. You feel stirrings of possibility, thoughts that perhaps this year will be different, that you will find the strength to quit using and rebuild your life. These feelings are sincere in the moment, genuine desires for change, yet they typically fade as the reality of addiction reasserts itself, as the daily struggle continues unchanged despite the changing seasons. Your child grows steadily through all of this, developing from year to year in ways both subtle and dramatic. They learn to read, to ride a bicycle, to navigate social relationships with increasing sophistication. They develop interests and preferences, personality traits that mark them as a unique individual rather than simply your child. You watch this development with pride and sorrow intermingled, proud of who they are becoming while sorrowful that you cannot provide better circumstances for their growth, that they must develop resilience and coping skills that children should not need. The conversations about your drug use, if they happen at all, are oblique and painful.
Your child might ask why you are tired so much, or why they cannot have friends over, or where the money went that was supposed to be for something they needed. You deflect and minimize, offering explanations that are technically true but fundamentally dishonest, protecting them from knowledge they are too young to process, while also protecting yourself from the full weight of their judgment. You tell yourself these lies are kindness, though you know they are also cowardice, your inability to face the truth of what you have become. There are moments of clarity when the full horror of your situation penetrates the denial and rationalization, when you see yourself as others might see you and are devastated by the vision. These moments typically come in the aftermath of some crisis or close call, times when the consequences of your addiction become impossible to ignore. Perhaps your child found your pipe, or you missed an important event, or you woke to discover hours had passed in a blackout of heavy use. In these moments, you swear to change, make promises to yourself and to whatever higher power you believe in, feel absolutely certain that you cannot continue living this way. Yet the addiction is patient and persistent, waiting out these moments of determination, knowing that cravings will return, that the discomfort of withdrawal and the stress of daily life will erode your resolve. Within days or sometimes hours, you find yourself using again, each relapse adding to the weight of failure, reinforcing the belief that you are powerless to change, that this life is simply who you are and who you will always be. The hope that flickered briefly is extinguished, replaced by resignation and the grim determination to simply continue surviving from one day to the next.